Welcome to Revival Cycles Tech Talk. This is Stefan, and in this episode, we are talking about crimping. Specifically, how to make a proper crimp and what types of tools do you need in order to do that. All right, so wire crimping. You've probably heard it discussed, you may have even tried it a few times, and ultimately you've most likely been doing it with something that looks a bit like this. This seems to be everybody's first crimper and the one that most of us just end up using all the time because, oh, it can do everything. The only problem with a tool like this is that it doesn't do anything well. So if you've got one of these, all right, that's cool. I used one just like this for a very long time before I finally realized that there were other options, and I want to cover what those other options are with you. So as we start to step up into other aspects of crimping tools, we might get into something like this, which is really kind of similar to this multi-tool, because this is also a multi-tool. It will strip up here with the jaws, and it will also crimp back here with these little goofy weird shaped things, and it can also cut with this tiny little blade here. But what you find out after using these for not that long is that they really don't work very well. The reason being is that you don't get enough leverage. So back here, if I'm trying to crimp something, I just don't have the mechanical advantage to really get a good solid crimp in this section. Additionally, as I get further back, I'm getting closer to my fingers, further away from the pivot, so all of these kind of crimp sections are really kind of not that effective. If this is all you have and you got really strong hands, you maybe can get a decent result. But for the rest of us, there are much, much better options out there. So for the basic two types of crimps, either the insulated and the uninsulated, a tool like this would work out fine. And you can see you've got both of those crimp sections forward of the pivot, nice long handles, so you get plenty of mechanical advantage, good solid crimp with this. And then we can get into some more of the specialty crimpers, and that's for like the open U style crimpers. And it's really difficult to see, but hopefully you can. There's a specific shape that's cut into this, this tool, and that's what will actually form this double U or this open barrel, or a bunch of different terminology is used to define like that classic double barrel automotive style crimp. And then there's also this one, which is used to form a square crimp, and that's very useful for installing ferrules on the ends of wires that are going into screw terminals. And we can get into this in just a little bit more detail in just a second. And then lastly, I've got up here, just for an illustrative purpose, this is a dedicated crimp tool for a very specific wire terminal. This tool has been set up for a production line or a production facility, and this is what they might use in a hand-assembled OEM operation, where they will actually put the wire terminal into this, and as you crimp it down, it will form all the sections of the wire terminal as you go, and then once it releases, you know you've reached the correct crimp force. So these are really cool, and they work for one specific type of terminal and one specific type of application, and they cost an awful lot. This is several $100s, and so this makes it pretty much useless for all of us, but I wanted to show you guys that these do exist, and this is the correct way to do it. So some dorky engineer out there says you're doing it wrong, you need one of these. Yeah, sure, yeah. You really don't. These are too expensive, forget about these. So that does leave us with a few other tools that we can go over. So let's start with the very, very basic crimp styles that you've probably seen before. And that's the classic kind of red, pink, yellow, or red, blue, yellow type of crimp terminals that you've seen. We usually run into these as butt connectors, and if you've ever worked on getting trailer lights to work, you've probably found a whole pile of these, and that's the reason that the trailer lights don't work. So how do these work? How do you use them? What's the best practice for using them? Let's start with a little bit of wire. I've got a small section here. Conveniently, it's already stripped. Now this is an 18 gauge wire, so I'm going to select a 18 gauge terminal. Now this, the interesting part about the reason that these have the colors that they have is because those colors correspond to specific wire sizes. So a yellow terminal should be a 10 to 12 gauge wire, a blue terminal should be a 16 to 14 gauge wire, and a red or pink terminal should be a 22 to 18 gauge wire. So since I've got 18 gauge, we're going to use this red one here. So if you were using, you know, the Fisher-Price My First crimpers, you would correspond the color of the connector with the dot on the crimper, and just go to town and squeeze the living crap out of this thing. Everything you got, just crimp it as hard as you possibly can, and that would give you a pretty okay crimp that might last for at least 10 or 15 minutes. So the next up in the realm of kind of efficacy, quality, etc., is this tool that has a better mechanical advantage, and that would actually allow you to get a pretty meaningful crimp on this guy. So as I go ahead and crimp this, what we see, and part of the reason I don't like these types of crimpers, is that it just kind of crushes and smashes the insulation, which defeats the whole purpose for the insulation, and we still didn't really get a great crimp. Yeah, it's not coming off of there, and if you're out in the wilderness and need to just get yourself home, sure, that works. Okay, moving on. But if this is in your workshop and you have the time to do it right, take the time and do it right. So that gets us to the way that I prefer to do our crimp terminations here in the shop. I don't like to use these pre-insulated type terminals because, well, you can't get a good crimp because the insulation's in the way. So let's go with an uninsulated terminal. And those look a bit like this. So with these terminals, you can see there's all metal. There's no insulation whatsoever. Quick strip a little bit of this guy. So then when we go to crimp this, we're going to use a slightly different section on the crimper. Put the wire in to the terminal. And then you notice on this crimper, it has insulated and non-insulated. So the non-insulated has kind of a bulge that goes into a valley. It's kind of like this single U shape. And I'm going to arrange this such that the open part, if we look real closely, we can see there's a split seam on this terminal. I'm going to put that split seam down to the bottom of the valley, and so that the bulge of this is pressing on the back of this section of the terminal. And now go ahead and crimp. And now I can crimp as hard as I want because I don't have any of that insulation in the way. I'm not going to cut through the insulation in my efforts to create the crimp. Now I can just crimp the crap out of it and know that it's a good solid connection. Later, after I've got my crimp complete, come back with a little bit of heat shrink, cover this over, and that gets you your insulation. So now you've got a known good crimped connection, and you can get a very good insulation using a heat-sealed heat shrink or even a single-wall polyolefin heat shrink. And that's one of the things that I didn't know right away in the beginning, in the early days, was that these uninsulated type terminals do in fact exist, and you can get a much better crimp. You also have the option, if you wanted to go for the gold and really be an overachiever, you can also add a dab of solder before you put that heat shrink on for the ultimate in electrical connections. So next up, after the uninsulated type terminals, and these uninsulated terminals do come in a lot of varieties. They're widely available. It's just most people don't know to look for them. Next up, let's take a look at some of these fancier type terminals that you find in more of an automotive style multi-pin connector. We've got a couple of these here in various sizes and shapes. And some of these get really, really small. So we've got a bunch of these in various sizes and shapes, and some of them do get very, very small, and it does require a little bit of a specialty tool to work with these effectively. Now, if you take a look at this terminal, you see that there's two kind of sections of these wings that stick up. This first one right here, that is going to be for the actual wire part of the crimp, and the ones behind are there to kind of grab the insulation portion of the crimp. So here's our handy dandy wire, and let's clip a little bit of this off and strip a little bit back. Now, the tool that I'm going to use for this is what is called an open U or a double barrel U crimper. And you can see that this has 5 different sizes on it, and each one of them creates this kind of double barrel type of crimp form. And the way that we set this up is to take a guess. This looks like a 18 gauge terminal, and although these are not labeled intelligently with anything like a number or a wire gauge, they do have A, B, C, D, etc. And I'm just eyeballing this through experience and guessing that I need to be on letter D. Some practice is always a good thing, so with our kits we always include a few extra terminals just so you do get that opportunity to practice, and you can make a couple mistakes before you commit to doing it for the final time. So now with this, I'll get this lined up. These terminals are a little bit tricky because they're just barely wide enough to fit in this tool, but they do fit. So then once I get that in there, I can introduce the wire. And now that I've got it in position, I can crimp down, squeeze it pretty authoritatively. And that crimped that front section, and we can see that this created a perfect little double U kind of crimp down that you see in these factory style terminations. That gets us the wires connected. Now we need to connect the insulation portion of the crimp. And for that, I'm going to use letter C and get that to fold over nicely and then just squeeze it down. Don't need to get super crazy on this because it's really just there to support the connection, support the joint, and hold the insulation in position. And there you go. That's how I will crimp a automotive style double U or open U double barrel crimp. Let's take a look at this, this terminal. This is probably going to be very difficult to see on camera, but this is an example of a terminal that is so small that I'm not going to be able to crimp these two sections at a different time. So instead what I'm going to do is very carefully get this wire in position and then pinch the back of this terminal just with my fingers a little bit so it'll stay in position and hold onto the wire while I get it arranged into my crimp tool. And because this is so small, it's going to use the smallest one, which is letter E, and very carefully position this in so that the U opens up into the top half with the little divot or the little peak, the pointy part in the form. And once I got that in there, just squeeze it, and that's going to crimp both the wire and the insulation section at the same time. And that's the way that I will deal with it on such a small terminal like this one. All right, so that's pretty much what we have to say for open U terminals. There's one other type of crimp connection that I wanted to cover with you guys, and that is a ferrule connection. That's not feral like feral cat or like feral animal like Andy. It's more about ferrules like for connecting wires into screw terminals. And that's a specific type of connector that really only has that use. Again, you can find them in insulated and uninsulated varieties. I always prefer the uninsulated so I can get a better crimp, and then I can also seal it with heat shrink, with a waterproof heat sealing heat shrink. A ferrule looks like this. You can see this is basically just a small tube of brass that's been plated with zinc or some other electrically conductive stuff, and they've flared this out into a bell mouth on one end. Now, that bell mouth seems like a very minor detail, but it has some real specific purposes. Let's go ahead and strip a little bit more of this wire, something like that. So the bell mouth does two things. One, it makes it easier for you to actually insert the wire into the ferrule. So that makes that a whole lot easier. And number two, it also gives a softer edge when this is vibrating in the application or the wires are being repeatedly bent back and forth because of some mechanical movement or something like that. The softer edge reduces the stress at that location and makes this joint last a lot longer from a fatigue standpoint. So what does this look like when we actually crimp it? We're going to use this crazy looking four-sided crimping tool, and that's known as a ferrule crimper. And we'll just insert these wires into the bell mouth end of this ferrule. Always a little challenging to get every last one in there, but with some practice you can get used to it. Then all you got to do is just push this guy into the jaws of the crimp tool, squeeze until the ratchet releases, and there you have it. That'll smash this down into a perfect little square, and each of these little ribs along all four sides helps to grab that wire and keep it from being able to be pulled back out. Now to finish this, I would just add a little bit of heat shrink such that it overlaps part of the ferrule and part of the wire, and that will help further strain relieve this joint and also seal it so it doesn't get any moisture in there, and it also doesn't fail due to vibration. So that's about it for ferrule crimping. You can find a lot of these terminals all over the place, your local automotive store, et cetera, but if you're looking for these specific type of crimping tools, we aren't really gonna sell or carry tools like this because they're literally everywhere. Just go to your local auto parts place and you'll find this piece of junk on the shelf and you can get it there. If you're looking for a combination stripper tool like this, we've got you covered. If you're looking for a ferrule tool like this, we've got you covered. If you need an open U double barrel crimp tool like this, we have you covered. And this one is my personal tool, so no, you can't have this one, and we don't sell this type because it's pretty well covered by the other ones here on the table. So I think that's pretty much all we have to say about crimp tools. go over to revivalcycles.com and you can check all these out, along with a ton of other great parts that we offer for custom building, for custom wiring, and generally just to look good while you're kicking around town. So with that, I'd like to ask you to subscribe, comment, like, share, etc. Let us know what you want to see us talk about, and we'll do our best to make it on the next video. Thanks for watching.